Welcome to Tyra Talks Truth, the podcast where honesty meets action and the real issues get a real voice. I'm your host, Tyra Trotman, unapologetically bold, unshakably grounded, and here to speak the truth that too many are afraid to say. From politics to people, policies to purpose, we're pulling back the curtain and calling it exactly how it is. No spin, no fluff, just facts, lived experiences, and the kind of conversations that create real change. This is more than a podcast, it's a movement. So grab your tea, open your mind, and get ready to hear the truth straight from Tyra. Good evening, Barbados, and good evening, my Instagram followers. If you don't know, my name is Tyra Trotman, and I will be your host for this evening with and introducing to you Tyra Talks Truth. Now, some of you may be familiar with me on social media. I usually do these type of lives where I bring national issues to the forefront and on social media for public debate and highlight national issues and concerns that are taking place. Now, crime is a hot topic, right? We've heard the opposition criticize the government on several occasions, saying that they're not doing enough to reduce crime. And then, of course, we have the government who is saying that crime is an all hands approach. All hands must be on the issue. It is not supposed to be a political issue. It is something where we need everyone to basically work towards reducing it. Now, in light of what has been happening, and more specifically, targets on home owners with home invasions, you have numerous burglaries happening. You also have women being targeted in terms of robberies and thefts. And then we also have the elderly. We all saw that video with the older gentleman in front of a credit union here in Barbados. So we had an instance in June where there was a home invasion in Wanstead, and someone saw through the door. We heard about that. They saw through the door in order to get inside. We also had the St. Philip home invasions back in February. I think there were like 3 of them. And then we had the 99-year-old who was reported to have been robbed at least 3 times in her Christchurch residence. So at the end of the day, I thought, let us look at what other countries have been doing in an effort to curb this inflation of crime. Now, in Trinidad and Tobago, we have the hot new bill, which is called the Home Invasion, Self-Defense and Defense of Property Act 2025. We know this bill is currently being debated under Kamala Prasad. This would have been a highlight in her campaign. We all saw the viral video when she said, "Stand your ground, load the matic, and let it rain, and call my name." So I said, let us take a look. I have the bill here before me. Let us take a look at the bill and see if this is something that Barbados should implement, seeing that Trinidad and Tobago is our sister country here in the Caribbean region. Now, at clause 4 of the bill, we have the interpretation sections where they basically lay out the definitions of what ought to be considered in this piece of legislation. And it makes a lot of mention to a dwelling house or something ancillary to the dwelling house. Under section 4(1)(a), under the term dwelling house, it said it includes any structure or part of a structure, whether permanent or temporary, and whether fixed or capable of being moved, which is designed or adapted for use as a dwelling or residence. Any adjacent land, building, or other structure within the same curtilage as a dwelling house and occupied for the same purpose or an associated place. It says a boat, a ship, or other vehicle in or on which a person resides, which has been designed or adapted for use as a dwelling or residence. And it defines associated place as that which is any place that is used exclusively in connection with or for the purposes ancillary to the occupation of a dwelling house. So I suspect something that could fall under that would be a shed. You know, most of us have sheds in the backyard where we store tools, perhaps. Some of us may have laundry rooms, which are separate and apart from the dwelling house, but obviously would still be on the property where one would do laundry. So those type of places would include would be considered under this particular bill. Now we also have the definition of what is defensive force, and we'll see why that is important later on in the bill. And it says defensive force means the justifiable and reasonable use of force by a person acting in self-defense, in defense of property, or in defense of another person. What does this mean? It means that this piece of legislation will protect you if it is that you're defending your own person, if you're defending your property, or if you're defending another person. Now, we would also have a definition of enters, which, as we know, would be very important because one might argue what is classified as entering. Is it my whole body, or is it a piece of my body, like a hand or a head, or is it me using something entering the property? So, for example, if I stick maybe a piece of metal through your window, is that considered entering, or does my hand actually have to go inside? And we'll see that entering here under the same section 4 is defined as intrusion by a person or an instrument they control. So that would answer then that question. Yes, it can also be an instrument that you're using. So a piece of steel, a cutlass, a rope, who knows, whatever you're using in order, a crowbar to get inside, or in relation to the one state home invasion, the saw, once that saw would have entered on the other side of the door, that person, on for the purposes of this piece of legislation, would have been deemed as entering the property, even had they not physically got inside. Now, if we look at section 5, this is the hot section. This section says, subject to the provisions of this act, an occupant who is in lawful possession of a dwelling house in which that person has a right to be at the material time has A, no duty to retreat from a home invader at the dwelling house, and B, the right to stand his ground and use or threaten to use defensive force to protect himself, another person, or his property from a home invader. Now, what is crucial to note is that this particular section makes it clear that in order for you to be considered under this piece of legislation, or protected rather, you have to be an occupant who is in lawful possession of your dwelling house and has a right to be there. So this section, or this legislation, piece of legislation, will not protect those persons who are trespassers. So, for example, you were renting, your lease has expired, or your landlord has issued you with a notice to quit, and therefore you're now on the property without having permission to be there. This piece of legislation will not protect you. Similarly, if you are a squatter and you have not surpassed the 10 or 20 years, depending on whether it is private or crown land, you also will not be protected under this piece of legislation. So that is very crucial to note. Now, at section 6, we have the definitions of what home invasion might be. And this obviously would be important because we would need to know who basically we have a right to defend ourselves against. So it can't be the mailman or a police officer. It has to be someone who falls under this section 6. So here it says, Subject to subsection 3, a person commits a home invasion if he A. unlawfully enters an occupied dwelling house when he knows or has reason to know that one or more persons is present in the dwelling house. B. unlawfully enters a dwelling house and remains therein until one or more person is present in the dwelling house. So what's important to note here is that you will be invading whether or not someone is home. Whether or not someone is home when you initially entered, if someone returns and finds you there, you are still considered invading that person's home. C. fraudulently represents himself to be a member of a law enforcement authority or a representative of any other public or private entity for the purpose of gaining entry into an occupied dwelling house. Now, this is important because someone can, say, "Hi, I'm from the water authority. I'm here to check your water meters." Yeah. So those type of persons who fraudulently present themselves to be someone who they're not to be, and you invite them in, upon recognizing obviously that these people are not who they say to be, and you have to protect yourself, you will also be protected under this piece of legislation. D is invited into an occupied dwelling house and fails to leave immediately on being asked by an occupant to do so, because once again, you could be invited in. You don't have to fraudulently misrepresent yourself, but you can be a friend, for example. As we know, sometimes, especially in sexual assault cases or rape cases, these things usually happen by persons who are known, not by strangers. So it could be a friend who has decided to visit you, and you being happy to see this friend, say, "Well, come on in and have a drink, let's chat, let's catch up." And then somewhere along the line, the person then starts to act what they on based on what their true intentions were, so they could begin to make advances on you, and push themselves on you, fondle you, or even force themselves on you. And this is obviously, it can go both ways, but mostly women are targeted. And upon this happening, if you tell the person to leave and they don't leave, and then you have to use reasonable force in order to protect your person, then you will also be protected under this piece of legislation. E enters an occupied dwelling house and then forms the intention to commit a serious criminal offense. And this is important, as we lawyers know. There are two elements to every crime. There's the mens rea, and then there's the actus reus. And sometimes persons may only form the mens rea at a later point in time, but not coincidental to when the actus reus was formed. So this will protect those types of situations, or rather, it will encompass, capsulate these types of situations. Now, H, intentionally causes an injury, including grievous bodily harm or death, or commits a grievous sexual assault or rape of any person in a dwelling house. I, steals any property with or without the use of intimidation, threats, or violence. J, damages or destroys any property with or without the use of intimidation, threats, or violence. K, intimidates, uses force, or threatens the imminent use of force on any person within the dwelling house, whether or not the injury occurs. And during the commission of an offense, discharges a firearm or detonates an explosive device. And we then have L, discharges a firearm or detonates an explosive device that causes grievous bodily harm, permanent disability, or permanent disfigurement to any person within the dwelling house. Now, K and L is important because, as we know, recently there have been a lot of firearm incidences where persons either, rob you or commit burglary with a firearm, whether they shoot at you or not, where persons have shot through homes. So they might be doing a drive-by and just shoot up your home, these type of things. Or, they come on the property with firearms or what looks like a firearm, because a lot of the time too, the firearms are not real. So we have these instances where Section 6 says that these would basically satisfy the conditions to amount to a home invasion. Now, what is also interesting to note is that subsection 2 of this section, Section 6, subsection 2, implements or imposes a fine and an imprisonment term. So it says a person who commits an offense under subsection 1 is liable on conviction on indictment to a fine of $500,000. Of course, this is TT. So in Barbados dollars, that would be approximately $143,000. And to imprisonment for 20 years. It says and. It says and, not or, it says and. So he's liable on conviction on indictment to a fine of $500,000 and to imprisonment for 20 years. So that's both. So obviously these penalties are very harsh, and you would find that legislators usually do this in an effort to deter the crime. Also, we see subsection 3 says where a person carries out a home invasion acting as a member of a gang, as a participant in an organized criminal activity, or in the presence of a child, senior citizen, and differently abled person or otherwise vulnerable person, that person commits an offense and is liable on conviction on indictment to a fine of $750,000 and to imprisonment for 25 years. So once again, that would be 750,000 TT, which would be approximately 215,000 Barbados dollars, and to imprisonment for 25 years. So you would see here that this section makes it harsher. The penalties are harsher where the home invasion is done in groups, whether a gang or other group, and also where the home invasion has occurred in the presence of what we would call a vulnerable category of person. So a child, an elderly person, or a member of the disabled community. So once again, it would show that the legislatures here, they obviously take the offense even more egregious where there's a vulnerable person involved, or where you have come together with other persons to commit such a heinous act. Now, section 7 is really where the action is, because section 7 is where it speaks to self-defense. So it says that subject to section 10, an occupant has no duty to retreat, and has the right to stand his ground against a home invader and use or threaten to use force against the home invader where the occupant A believes on reasonable grounds, one, that force was being used against him or another person, or that a threat of force was being made against him or another person, or two, that his life or the life of another person was in immediate danger or threat of danger. B believes that his actions were necessary and reasonable in order to defend or protect himself or another person from the use or threat of use of force. And C establishes that the defensive force used was proportionate to the threat he honestly believed to exist. So what is crucial to note here is that not only does it have to be the actual use of force, but it could also be a threat of this use of force. But it seems that this section 7 implements conditions that you would need to satisfy, you as the homeowner would need, or home occupant rather, would need to satisfy in order to be protected by section 7 of this piece of legislation. So we know that here in this piece of legislation, a home occupant has a right to stand his ground and does not need to retreat. Now, this is interesting because at the end of the day, when we get into these type of situations, not everyone's intuition or instinct, not everyone's instinct is to run and hide. There are persons who, like myself, their first instinct might be to fight, right? Because there's fight and there's flight. So where there's persons who, under a threat of imminent force towards themselves, may run and hide. They may call the police. They may, disappear from the situation. And then there are other persons who would stand and actually defend themselves rather than run away. So this piece of legislation protects those persons who are minded to stand up for themselves, stand their ground. So putting it into a real life scenario, Someone breaks into your home, and instead of you running and hiding in the cupboards or under your bed or exiting through another door and calling the police, you may decide to take matters into your own hands, and you may have a licensed firearm. And once it is that the force is deemed to be reasonable, in that the person may enter with a firearm themselves, then you will be justified in your actions to go ahead then and retrieve or get your firearm and obviously then shoot that person. So that protects those type of situations, right? But when you do that, it says here that you will have to prove that you believed and reasonably believed so, at which anytime you hear reasonably believes, that's an objective test. So it's no longer subjective, meaning it isn't enough for you to say that you believed that you had reasonable grounds to use force, but the court will also take into consideration if a person in your circumstances would have done the same thing, basically, right? So believes on reasonable grounds that force was being used against you or was likely to occur, basically because there was threat of force, or that your life or another person's life was in immediate danger, and then also that your actions were necessary and reasonable in order to defend yourself. So a situation where this piece of legislation may not protect you is if someone comes into your home, is not armed, doesn't have any weapons as far as you can see, and basically came in, they found your purse on the counter, they took out your purse, and as soon as they took out your purse, they were going to run out through the door. In that scenario, obviously, if you shoot the person, you would have been shooting them while they are backing you. So they would not be coming towards you, but actually ready to head out. So if you take out your gun and shoot that person, then, it could be argued that the force was not reasonable. It was not reasonable for you to go ahead and shoot that person. And then you also have to establish that the force used was proportionate to the threat. So once again, if someone comes in your home not carrying a weapon and you discharge your firearm, you will have to prove, the burden and onus of proof will be on you to show that in those circumstances, the force you shooting that person was reasonable. Now, if we look at Section 8, we have the defense of property. So once again, this legislation not only speaks to protecting or standing your ground in relation to your person or a person of another, but it also speaks to protecting your property. So it says here, subject to Section 10, an occupant has no duty to retreat and has the right to stand his ground against a home invader and use or threaten to use force against the home invader or do anything else that he believes on reasonable grounds to be necessary, A, to prevent a home invader from entering his dwelling house or an associated place, B, to cause a home invader who is in his dwelling house or an associated place to leave the dwelling house or associated place, C, to protect his property or the property of another person from theft, damage, or destruction by a home invader, or D, to prevent a home invader from committing or to stop a home invader from committing a serious criminal offense in his dwelling house or an associated place. So this basically speaks to that situation where the person's intention may not be to harm you, but it may be just to come in and steal something from you. You will also have rights under this section to basically stand your ground against the person and use force against the home invader. But once again, we have to remember that the force needs to be reasonable force. So in other words, if someone comes in and the scenario I just posed, they take up your purse and they're about to head out through the door, instead of shooting them, because like I said, it could be argued that that force was not reasonable, you would have a right then to knock them out. If you are trained in self-defense and martial arts, you might be able to use some of that training and restrain or knock out the person, basically in an effort to stop them from getting away with your property. Or for example, another example may be that you might strike them with a pan on the stove or something, hit them on top of their head or something with an instrument that you have in your home that may be seen to be reasonable. Now, Section 9 also speaks to persons. It also protects persons who act in good faith and come to your aid. So it says here, Section 9, for the purposes of Section 7 and 8, it is lawful for a person acting in good faith in aid of an occupant during a home invasion, or who acts on the direction of an occupant during a home invasion, to use the same degree of force against a home invader that an occupant may reasonably use. So basically, that is, if I'm home, for example, the 99-year-old woman, she may not be able to use force herself, but she might call out for help, and a neighbor might hear her and play good Samaritan and come to her rescue. This piece of legislation under Section 9 will also protect that good Samaritan. And now we have certain exceptions under Section 10, which say that Section 7 and 8 do not apply where a person against whom force is used or threatened has the right to be in or is an occupant in the dwelling house. B, the degree of force used by an occupant is grossly disproportionate in the circumstances. C, the occupant who uses or threatens to use force is engaged in criminal activity or is using the dwelling house to further criminal activity. So drug dealers, if somebody come and to steal your weed, your marijuana, and you have to use force, this legislation will not protect you. The person against whom the force is used or threatened is a member of law enforcement authority who enters or attempts to enter the dwelling house. And this, of course, it's obvious, but it might not be so obvious to other people. So this will be situations where the police have to come in your home to raid your home, because in those circumstances you may feel as though they had no permission to come inside of your home, even though we know they need a warrant. But there's certain circumstances where they do not need a warrant. So if for example, you're running from the police and it's a pursuit, and you run into your home and you shut the door, and they basically kick down the door, they do not need a warrant in those circumstances, and you will not be protected if you then go ahead and decide to use some sort of force against that police officer in your home. You will not be protected, and furthermore, you might just get charged with the usual charges you would get, which is assaulting a police officer during the course of his duties or execution of his duties, and so forth. E, the occupant who uses or threatens to use force knew or reasonably should have known that the person entering or attempting to enter the dwelling house was a member of a law enforcement authority acting in the lawful executions of his duties. So this will be situations where, as we know, the CID and certain police officers don't always wear uniform, but you may know, due to the fact that you would see the unmarked, we call them unmarked jeeps outside. You would most definitely, or they have on police vests, maybe, or they're accompanied by other members who are, in fact, wearing uniform. You should have some sort of reasonable belief there that even though that person who's using the force against you, are not clad with the uniform, in those circumstances, you should reasonably know that they should be or ought to be police officers. So that is basically the piece of legislation, once again, the Home Invasion, Self-Defense and Defense of Property Bill 2025, which is currently being debated in the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago. Now, countries, I looked at, I did some research, and I basically found that there are certain countries who have already implemented these home invasion laws, and these are countries like the United States of America, as we know, Canada, Australia, England and Wales, France, and now newly Trinidad and Tobago. Now, so some of the things I was asking myself is, have these home invasion laws in the countries that have already implemented them made a difference? Has it really been able to reduce crime, and not just crime more generally and broadly, but burglaries and robberies and other acts of theft. So the USA, some statistics from them show that there was actually an 8% increase in homicides without the reduction in burglaries, robberies, or aggravated assaults. And in Florida, it was reported that 24 to 45, there was a 24 to 45% rise in firearm and total homicides after the stand your ground law took effect. And that, so it seems in the USA, although we don't really know if it's a coincidence or if the two are directly related, but it would seem that since there were stand your ground home invasion laws, there was actually an increase in homicides and not necessarily a decrease in the reduction of burglaries, robberies, and aggravated assaults. But if we look at Australia, on the other hand, Australia reported in NSW that there was a 22.9% decline in breaking and entering. And in Victoria, there was a drop from 41,800 incidents to in 2019 to 33,200 and I think that's 8 incidents in 2020. So there was a slight decline since the home invasion laws were implemented in Australia, and also West Australia, the home invasion laws reduced home invasions and other related crimes by half. And in South Australia, there was a 35% was 35% fewer serious residential trespasses. So in one scenario in the USA, they're saying that it really didn't make a difference. In fact, it made crime worse because you would have seen an increase in homicides, which, as you can imagine, you would know why. And then in Australia, on the other hand, there was some evidence of a decrease. So maybe, it might not be a one fit all type of legislation where it's guaranteed that the legislation will work for your jurisdiction, but it's something that Barbados perhaps could consider to see if it will lean towards the USA side or towards the Australian side. Now, what I must say is that apart from the home invasion laws, there are other things that homeowners or home occupants can do in order to protect themselves. We know that, you would need to obviously strengthen your security system. So that means, having better locks and better doors, having cameras and alarm systems. In fact, there is statistics to show that homes with alarm systems and cameras are 2.5 to 3 times less likely to be targeted. And then we can also, which I see a lot of now in Barbados, but I think there ought to be more, form more neighborhood watch groups where you as a community come together and stand together in order to fight crime in your particular community. So at the end of the day, that has been the new hot topic. And so I thought, why not bring this home invasion legislation to the forefront and get your thoughts on it. Some of the advantages, I must say, with the home invasion legislation would be that it gives homeowners more protection, more security. It gives you rights, home occupants and homeowners. It gives you rights, some sort of power back, where you don't have to sit and wait for police officers to show up to your doorstep. You can take matters into your own hands if you feel as though you're capable to do so. So I would say that is a huge advantage to this type of legislation. But obviously there are disadvantages, which would be that you might actually see a rise in homicides or what we would consider crime, violence, because, one person will be protecting themselves against another. So you're fighting fire with fire, basically. So this has been Tyra Talks Truth, and I will see you next Tuesday. Have a great weekend. Have a great crop over. Enjoy yourself. Be safe. Thank you for your time.